Chapter 7 of Narrative of the Life of David Crockett of the State of Tennessee. Soon after this, an army was to be raised to go to Pensacola, and I determined to go again with them, for I wanted a small taste of British fighting, and I supposed they would be there. Here again the entreaties of my wife were thrown in the way of my going, but all in vain, for I always had a way of just going ahead at whatever I had a mind to. One of my neighbors, hearing I had determined to go, came to me and offered me $100 to go in his place as a substitute, as he had been drafted. I told him I was better raised than to hire myself out to be shot at, but that I would go, and he should go too, and in that way the government would have the services of us both. But we didn't call General Jackson the government in those days, though we used to go and fight under him in the war. I fixed up and joined old Major Russell again, but we couldn't start with the main army, but followed on in a little time after them. In a day or two we had 130 men in our company, and we went over and crossed the Muscle Shoals at the same place where I had crossed when first out, and when we burned the Black Warriors' town. We passed through the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations on to Fort Stevens, and from thence to what is called the Cut-Off at the junction of the Tom Bigby with the Alabama River. This place is near the old Fort Mims, where the Indians committed the great butchery at the commencement of the war. We were here about 2 days behind the main army, who had left their horses at the Cut-Off, and taken it on foot, and they did this because there was no chance for forage between there and Pensacola. We did the same, leaving men enough to take care of our horses, and cut out on foot for that place. It was about 80 miles off, but in good heart we shouldered our guns, blankets, and provisions, and trudged merrily on. About 12 o'clock the second day, we reached the encampment of the main army, which was situated on a hill overlooking the city of Pensacola. My commander, Major Russell, was a great favorite with General Jackson, and our arrival was hailed with great applause, though we were a little after the feast, for they had taken the town and fort before we got there. That evening we went down into the town, and could see the British fleet lying in sight of the place. We got some liquor, and took a horn or so, and went back to the camp. We remained there that night, and in the morning we marched back towards the Cut-Off. We pursued this direction till we reached old Fort Mims, where we remained 2 or 3 days. It was here that Major Russell was promoted from his command, which was only that of a captain of spies, to the command of a major in the line. He had been known long before at home as old Major Russell, and so we all continued to call him in the army. A Major Childs from East Tennessee also commanded a battalion, and his and the one Russell was now appointed to command composed a regiment, which by agreement with General Jackson was to quit his army and go to the south to kill up the Indians on the Scambie River. General Jackson and the main army set out the next morning for New Orleans, and a Colonel Blue took command of the regiment, which I have before described. We remained, however, a few days after the general's departure, and then started also on our route. As it gave rise to so much war and bloodshed, it may not be improper here to give a little description of Fort Mims, and the manner in which the Indian War commenced. The fort was built right in the middle of a large old field, and in it the people had been forted so long and so quietly that they didn't apprehend any danger at all, and had therefore become quite careless. A small Negro boy, whose business it was to bring up the calves at milking time, had been out for that purpose, and on coming back he said he saw a great many Indians. At this the inhabitants took the alarm, and closed their gates and placed out their guards, which they continued for a few days. But finding that no attack was made, they concluded the little Negro had lied, and again threw their gates open and set all their hands out to work their fields. The same boy was out again on the same errand, when, returning in great haste and alarm, he informed them that he had seen the Indians as thick as trees in the woods. He was not believed, but was tucked up to receive a flogging for the supposed lie, and was actually getting badly licked at the very moment when the Indians came in a troop, loaded with rails with which they'd stopped all the portholes of the fort on one side except the bastion, and then they fell into cutting down the picketing. Those inside the fort had only the bastion to shoot from, as all the other holes were spiked up, and they shot several of the Indians while engaging in cutting. But as fast as one would fall, another would seize up the axe and chop away, until they succeeded in cutting down enough of the picketing to admit them to enter. They then began to rush through, and continued until they were all in. They immediately commenced scalping without regard to age or sex, having forced the inhabitants up to one side of the fort, where they carried on the work of death as a butcher would in a slaughter pen. The scene was particularly described to me by a young man who was in the fort when it happened, and subsequently went on with us to Pensacola. He said that he saw his father and mother, his 4 sisters, and the same number of brothers all butchered in the most shocking manner, and that he made his escape by running over the heads of the crowd who were against the fort wall to the top of the fort, and then jumping off and taking to the woods. He was closely pursued by several Indians until he came to a small bayou across which there was a log. He knew the log was hollow on the underside, so he slipped under the log and hid himself. He said he heard the Indians walk over him several times back and forward. He remained, nevertheless, still till night, when he came out and finished his escape. The name of this young man has entirely escaped my recollection, though his tale greatly excited my feelings. But to return to my subject. The regiment marched from where General Jackson had left us to Fort Montgomery, which was distant from Fort Mims about 1.5 miles, and there we remained for some days. Here we supplied ourselves pretty well with beef by killing wild cattle which had formerly belonged to the people who perished in the fort, but had gone wild after their massacre. When we marched from Fort Montgomery, we went some distance back towards Pensacola. Then we turned to the left, and passed through a poor piney country till we reached the Scamby River, near where we encamped. We had about 1,000 men, and as a part of that number, 186 Chickasaw and Choctaw Indians with us. That evening a boat landed from Pensacola, bringing many articles that were both good and necessary, such as sugar and coffee and liquors of all kinds. The same evening, the Indians we had along proposed to cross the river, and the officers, thinking it might be well for them to do so, consented, and Major Russell went with them, taking 16 white men, of which number I was one. We camped on the opposite bank that night, and early in the morning we set out. We had not gone far before we came to a place where the whole country was covered with water, and looked like a sea. We didn't stop for this, though, but just put in like so many spaniels and waded on, sometimes up to our armpits, until we reached the Pine Hills, which made our distance through the water about 1.5 miles. Here we struck up a fire to warm ourselves, for it was cold, and we were chilled through by being so long in the water. We again moved on, keeping our spies out, 2 to our left near the bank of the river, 2 straight before us, and 2 others on our right. We had gone in this way about 6 miles up the river, when our spies on the left came to us leaping the brush like so many old bucks, and informed us that they had discovered a camp of Creek Indians, and that we must kill them. Here we paused for a few minutes, and the prophets powwowed over their men a while, and then got out their paint and painted them, all according to their custom when going into battle. Then they brought their paint to old Major Russell, and said to him that as he was an officer he must be painted too. He agreed, and they painted him just as they had done themselves. We let the Indians understand that we white men would first fire on the camp, and then fall back so as to give the Indians a chance to rush in and scalp them. The Chickasaws marched on our left hand and the Choctaws on our right, and we moved on till we got in hearing of the camp, where the Indians were employed in beating up what they called Cheney briar root. On this they mostly subsisted. On a nearer approach we found they were on an island, and that we could not get to them. While we were chatting about this matter, we heard some guns fired, and in a very short time after, a keen whoop, which satisfied us that wherever it was, there was a war on a small scale. With that we all broke like quarter horses for the firing, and when we got there we found it was our two front spies, who related to us the following story. As they were moving on, they had met with two Creeks who were out hunting near their horses. As they approached each other, there was a large cluster of green bay bushes exactly between them, so that they were within a few feet of meeting before either was discovered. Our spies walked up to them, and, speaking in the Shawnee tongue, informed them that General Jackson was at Pensacola, and they were making their escape, and wanted to know where they could get something to eat. The Creeks told them that 9 miles up the Conacher, the river they were then on, there was a large camp of Creeks, and they had cattle and plenty to eat, and further that their own camp was on an island about a mile off and just below the mouth of the Conacher. They held their conversation and struck up a fire, and smoked together and shook hands and parted. One of the Creeks had a gun, the other had none, and as soon as they had parted, our Choctaws turned round and shot down the one that had the gun, and the other attempted to run off. They snapped several times at him, but the gun still missing fire, they took after him, and overtaking him, one of them struck him over the head with his gun and followed up his blows till he killed him. The gun was broken in the combat, and they then fired off the gun of the Creek they had killed, and raised the war whoop. When we reached them, they had cut off the heads of both the Indians, and each of those Indians with us would walk up to one of the heads, and taking his war club, would strike on it. This was done by every one of them, and when they had got done, I took one of their clubs and walked up as they had done, and struck it on the head also. At this they all gathered round me, and patting me on the shoulder, called me warrior, warrior. They scalped the heads, and then we moved on a short distance to where we found a trace leading in towards the river. We took the trace and pursued it, till we came to where a Spaniard had been killed and scalped, together with a woman, who we supposed to be his wife, and also 4 children. I began to feel mighty ticklish along about this time, for I knowed if there was no danger then, there had been, and I felt exactly like there still was. We, however, went on till we struck the river, and then continued down it till we came opposite to the Indian camp, where we found they were still beating their roots. It was now late in the evening, and they were in a thick canebrake. We had some few friendly Creeks with us who said they could decoy them, so we all hid behind trees and logs while the attempt was made. The Indians would not agree that we should fire, but picked out some of their best gunners, and placed them near the river. Our Creeks went down to the riverside, and hailed the camp in the Creek language. We heard an answer, and an Indian man started down toward the river, but didn't come in sight. He went back again, commenced beating his roots, and sent a squaw. She came down and talked with our Creeks until dark came on. They told her they wanted her to bring them a canoe, to which she replied that their canoe was on our side, that 2 of their men had gone out to hunt their horses and hadn't yet returned. They were the same 2 we had killed. The canoe was found, and 40 of our picked Indian warriors were crossed over to take the camp. There was at last only 1 man in it, and he escaped, and they took 2 squaws and 10 children, but killed none of them, of course. We had run nearly out of provisions, and Major Russell had determined to go up the Conacher to the camp we had heard of from the Indians we had killed. I was one that he selected to go down the river that night for provisions with the canoe to where we had left our regiment. I took with me a man by the name of John Guess and one of the friendly Creeks, and cut out. It was very dark, and the river was so full that it overflowed the banks and the adjacent low bottoms. This rendered it very difficult to keep the channel, and particularly as the river was very crooked. At about 10 o'clock at night we reached the camp, and were to return by morning to Major Russell with provisions for his trip up the river. But on informing Colonel Blue of this arrangement, he vetoed it as quick as General Jackson did the bank bill, and said if Major Russell didn't come back the next day it would be bad times for him. I found we were not to go up the Conacher to the Indian camp, and a man of my company offered to go up in my place to inform Major Russell. I let him go, and they reached the Major, as I was told, about sunrise in the morning, who immediately returned with those who were with them to the regiment, and joined us where we crossed the river, as hereafter stated. The next morning we all fixed up and marched down the Scamby to a place called Miller's Landing, where we swam our horses across and sent on 2 companies down on the side of the bay opposite to Pensacola, where the Indians had fled when the main army first marched to that place. One was the company of Captain William Russell, a son of the old Major, and the other was commanded by a Captain Trimble. They went on and had a little skirmish with the Indians. They killed some, and took all the balance prisoners, though I don't remember the numbers. We again met those companies in a day or 2, and sent the prisoners they had taken on to Fort Montgomery in charge of some of our Indians. I did hear that after they left us, the Indians killed and scalped all the prisoners, and I never heard the report contradicted. I cannot positively say it was true, but I think it entirely probable, for it is very much like the Indian character. End of chapter 7.